If you were to take a world history class, and this could be really at any level on the educational spectrum, but if you were to take a world history class, you would not learn much about the American Civil War. This would just be a tiny blip on the radar screen of your course. You might mention it in relation to how it kind of was a precursor to World War I and kind of, ushered in the modern era of warfare. It might get, a couple minutes worth of discussion or a sentence or two in your textbook, or at most a paragraph. So to the rest of the world and to people who study world history, the Civil War is not often something that is significantly investigated as a, cog in the machine of the great, chain of global events. But that being the case, all you have to do is live in America and pay even a mild amount of attention to what's going on in the news, what's going on in society, to understand that the American Civil War has a huge impact. And although it might just be a tiny blip on the world radar, there's people in this country 150 years later who are literally willing to die over some of the ideas and some of the traditions that come from the Civil War. So whether it's debates over the cause of the war or, the Confederate flag or any of these other issues that we often see in the news today, or we see examples of violence or humiliation or, all sorts of other stuff, debates, congressional action, whatever, it's obvious that this tiny blip on the radar of world history is something that's significant, and it has a human element, and that human element kind of plays out even to this day. So it just demonstrates the need to not overlook these historical blips on the radar, because look how just heavily invested and emotional people are about the American Civil War in America. You can imagine how the same thing would apply in other societies to situations and events and things of that nature that we don't particularly look at in depth in our study of history. So it's important to keep these historical blips in mind so that we don't lose track of that human element and don't lose track that actual people were taking part in these events and suffering and, feeling emotions and all these things when we look at world history. So take, for example, the battle at Shiloh in 1862. This was early in the war, and it's something that, honestly, not a lot of people know about. I mean, if you talk with your average history buff, he or she will give you those kind of name-check battles, Gettysburg, Vicksburg, Antietam, etc., and they'll be able to quote all sorts of statistics and things like that. But how many people know that 23,000 people died in just a few days early on in the war at the Battle of Shiloh? And this was something that would foreshadow just the human wasteland that would become these battlefields during the Civil War. And that in turn would foreshadow just the devastation that would occur in modern warfare moving forward throughout the world, in particular World War I. So this episode is not meant as a comprehensive overview of the Civil War or, all the battles and all the narrative history and all that stuff. This will just be more of kind of my view on the war, some thoughts on the more underrated aspects of the war, some of those events that don't necessarily get covered in your average history class, and of course that human element of the war, kind of that, human emotion and ingenuity and inspiration that makes you wonder if perhaps this was the last war between gentlemen. The American Civil War was far and away the bloodiest and most devastating conflict for Americans that the United States of America has ever gotten involved in. So if you look at the conservative estimates, and I've seen estimates ranging from 600,000 casualties to 800,000 casualties, so let's be conservative and call it 650,000 casualties happened during the Civil War in America, and there's people who think even higher than 800,000 is actually possible. So let's be conservative and say 650,000 people, were casualties in this war. That is more than all of the other wars and all of the other casualties in those other wars combined. So the American Civil War, clearly the most devastating and violent event in American history. And that's not even factoring in the civilian factor. And the civilian factor is, the fact that you basically had armies roving around the entire eastern portion of the United States, essentially marching through people's front yards. So towns were burned, cities were burned, livestock was, used, farmland was destroyed. This was a total war, and this was something that devastated whole states and whole regions of the country. Now, given this fact, there are incredibly heated arguments over what was the cause of the Civil War. What was the cause of all of this death and destruction that we'll get into in a second? And the answer to this question is both complex and simple. So the complex answer is there's a whole, string of cause and effect that is going to, pull together all these different factors, and that's going to lead to the Civil War. But the simple answer is that slavery caused the Civil War. So that is the simplest and probably most accurate answer as to what caused the Civil War. And the reason for that is that any of those kind of cause effects, or other causes that you could mention, at the root of those issues is the issue of slavery. Okay, so those issues are not issues, or at least major issues, that would lead to civil war unless slavery is there. So let me explain. So a lot of people teach that, in fact, it actually wasn't slavery that caused this war. It was an issue over states' rights. So states' rights was the main issue, and that led to the Civil War. So these people think that, states like South Carolina and, Georgia and these southern states, they wanted the ability to be sovereign, and they wanted the ability not to be interfered with by the federal government. And that's the main cause of the war. And to that, I would say, sure, these states were fighting for states' rights, but why were they doing that? They were doing that because of slavery. They wanted to maintain slavery in their state as the foundation, the economic foundation of kind of what they were doing. So you don't have these big states' rights issues without the issue of slavery. There's just no way that states' rights issue would be big enough or inflammatory enough to cause a civil war without slavery being there to begin with. You might also hear as another potential cause that there's some sort of economic or just sectional differences between the two areas of the country, the North and the South, and this was going to inevitably lead to war. And again, that is a true statement, but the cause of those sectional differences was slavery. So if it's an economic difference between the North and South, what's the economic difference? The difference is slavery. So again, without slavery being that kind of ignition, that inflammatory factor, you don't have the Civil War. And then you might actually see a more nuanced argument about self-determination. So kind of this idea that the Founding Fathers definitely put forward in, documents like the Declaration of Independence, that human beings have the right to self-determination. They have the right to govern themselves without interference from a kind of a big government. And while that may be the case, that may be the way some people thought about the Civil War at the time, okay, where was the popular vote? Where was the big vote in the South where everybody got together and they kind of determined that they wanted to be their own country? Okay, that didn't happen. So that decision was made by a select few without the input of everyone as a whole. Okay, and again, I would argue the cause of wanting that self-determination was to maintain slavery. Okay, so in my opinion, slavery, the main cause of the Civil War, and those other factors, absolutely important and absolutely contributing factors, but without slavery, you don't have that spark and you don't have the Civil War. So it seems that slavery is the cause of the Civil War. Now, don't confuse that argument I just made with the fact that, the Union is the good guys and the South is the bad guys. Okay, because that's not what I'm saying here. In fact, it's a lot more nuanced, and arguments can be made as to whether the Civil War was even a just war, or whether the Union waged it in a way that was ethical, or kind of some of the things that both sides end up doing as far as, committing atrocities and unethical behaviors and human rights violations. All of these things are going to be problematic, and that's kind of the main point, is that that's one of these things about Civil War, is that these things are ugly, these things are bloody, and by the end of it, you're left wondering who's in the right, who's in the wrong, and, does it even matter at this point? Another thing about civil wars is that they're often called brothers' wars, or wars between brothers. And the reason this is the case is because civil wars split up families. So you might have, and this happened a lot during the Civil War, two brothers fighting on opposite sides of the spectrum, or a father fighting for the Union and a son fighting for the South, the Confederacy, or, families just torn apart. So the concept of a brothers' war is something that makes civil wars all the more intense. An example of this is the story of William and Clifton Prentice. In 1857, these two brothers from Maryland got in a fight, an argument over the slavery question. One of them, thought slavery was wrong. One of them thought, I'm willing to defend the Confederacy for this. So they split sides. They ended up fighting for the Union for 8 years and for the Confederacy for 8 years. And then they actually met on the battlefield. And this happened at Petersburg, but the battle raged, and one of the brothers essentially got both of his legs blown off. And I believe he was fighting for the South, and kind of the Union kind of took him in and tried to, do their best to relieve his suffering. The brother asked him, hey, do you know my brother? Have you ever heard of him? And it turns out this was the actual regiment and unit that his brother was actually working with. So they bring them together, and at first they kind of, argue and bicker a little bit, but by the end of it, they're both crying, and they're both, hugging it out essentially, and getting back together as brothers. So it's kind of one of those inspirational stories that you get when you look at civil wars. Unfortunately, as, a sad end note, the brother who had his legs blown off would die of, complications from that, and then a couple of weeks later, his brother would die as well. So another example of how in war, it's tough to find the winners. I think it was Winston Churchill who said, in war, it's not who's right, it's only who's left. As in who's left after the smoke and the dust and the battles and the violence goes away. And speaking of families being torn apart, it would be incredibly remiss if we didn't at least discuss just the unbelievable situation it must have been like to have been a slave or a freed slave or really any sort of black person in America during the Civil War and the period leading up to it. In 1850, Congress passed something called the Fugitive Slave Act. And what the Fugitive Slave Act essentially said was that slaves and runaway slaves who kind of reached safety in the North, who fled from the Confederacy, fled from the South, those former slaves could actually be recaptured by their masters and brought back into slavery. And this was okay by the law. Now, what this essentially meant, reading between the lines and looking at what actually happened, was that you could have essentially roving bands of kidnappers just roving through cities and roving through countrysides, essentially snatching up any black person and bringing them back into the South and selling them into slavery, in order to make a buck. That's difficult to imagine what life would have been like, constantly worried about, roving bands of lunatics coming and taking you away from your family or taking your sons or daughters away from you as a parent, and that's simply unbelievable. It reminds you of what the Jews must have felt like, as Nazi Germany was kind of ramping up and, building towards the Holocaust. Always looking over your shoulder, never knowing when those people are going to come to take you. There's a story of a woman named Margaret Garner, a former slave, who ends up killing her children rather than letting them be sold back into slavery. Clearly, just the extremes of human behavior that were being experienced is really something that's difficult to fathom today, and incredibly sad, the situations that these people were in. Now, a lot of blacks and freed slaves ended up avoiding this fate, or at least attempting to avoid this fate, by joining up with the Union Army. So almost 180,000 Union troops came from the ranks of black folks or, freed slaves or whatever you want to call it there, but almost 180,000 people. And they fought in a number of battles, fighting, valiantly by all reports, just as well as anyone else. One of the things that's interesting is that the way these people were treated by the opposition was not always the way that white people were treated on the battlefield. So if you go up and look at some of the statistics at some of these battles where black soldiers were fighting, the level of casualties is significantly higher than the level of prisoners of war taken. So in most Civil War battles, there would be a certain number of people who died, but a large number would surrender, and then the rest would be taken prisoners. So a lot of times when these black troops fought, you can look up the massacre at Fort Pillow as kind of, some evidence of this, but a lot of times those casualties would be way higher than the number of people who were prisoners of war. So it's difficult to know what exactly was happening in those scenarios, but a lot of historians have kind of, concluded that perhaps, these troops, after they surrendered, were actually being massacred. So there's very heated debate over whether or not that's the case. But it is something to look into, and, just another one of those blips on the historical kind of radar screen. And it's something that is incredibly worthwhile and interesting to look at. Another historical blip on the radar screen during this war is something that is wildly undervalued and underanalyzed and overlooked. And to me, this is the suffering of animals. So most Civil War regiments, had a huge number of horses. They went with them. They had dogs coming into the fray. A lot of men would actually, as a way to kind of spend time and, fight against the loneliness, would maintain a dog as a pet. And these pets would be loyal, and they would be mascots for the troops. So there's one example of a dog who became close with his owner, who was obviously fighting in the Civil War, and that owner died on the battlefield, and rather than, from the dog's perspective, rather than moving on with the rest of his troops, he stayed there with his owner and ended up dying on the battlefield right next to his owner. So a symbol of that love and devotion between animal and human there, master and pet. Stonewall Jackson, one of the most famous generals in American history, his horse was known as Little Sorrel. And apparently Stonewall had a, deep and loving connection with this animal, and they kind of, had a deep respect for each other. And this was something that he talked about openly, and a lot of people in his regiment and his group, his unit, knew about. And this was something that, historians have looked at ever since. And when you look at the numbers are simply staggering. So during the Civil War, really just a couple of years of battle, close to 2 million horses would die. And they would die for a variety of reasons. Oftentimes horses would be prime targets in battle, because if you can take away, the opponent's cavalry, you can deal him a large blow. A lot of times these animals were just dying from starvation or lack of shelter, disease, cold, you name it, neglect. And it's disappointing to think about the number of horses who just died simply as a result of not being able to, have food, or being neglected by their owners, not having blankets when it got into cold months in the winter. So the fact that 2 million horses died, that means something. These are animals who can, feel happiness, and they can suffer, and they can have deep bonds with their owners, and they can have, deep connections with humans and other animals. So this is something that needs to be factored into the calculations when we're determining what the end results of a war are. And a lot of times this is something that's just simply not talked about. I can't remember ever getting into a class discussion or, reading about it in a textbook or anything like that, talking about the suffering of animals during these wars. And this is something we see in the Civil War, World War I, World War II, okay, so on and so forth. So something to keep in mind as we look at other battles, other wars, other situations in history. Don't forget about the suffering of animals. Don't let that be another blip on the radar screen of history. So it's clear that animals suffered during this war, and there's no doubt that humans did as well. I mean, all you really have to do to understand the suffering of people during the Civil War is just take a look at the aftermath of any one of these battles. For example, let's take a look at one of the battles of Gettysburg. So in the aftermath of the battle, there were literally tens of thousands of human corpses strewn across a huge battlefield. Fires were burning, trees are on fire, corpses are on fire, ash and smoke is coming up from the mud and the grit, and the smell of death is just everywhere. Then you factor in the wounded who are actually begging to die because they have their limbs, essentially blown off, and they need a way out. And you have medical people trying to figure out who's likely to survive, and they go in this place, this pile, and people who are likely to die are going to be moved somewhere else where they continue to moan and stress and be in pain and suffering. So this is not a pleasant place to be. And this is, as historian James Robertson says, the true picture of war. Here's an example of one of those soldiers wounded on the battlefield writing a note to his mother. Quote, "I am here a prisoner of war and mortally wounded. I can live but a few hours more at farthest. I am very weak. Do not mourn my loss. I had hoped to have been spared, but a righteous God has ordered it otherwise. Farewell to you all." End quote. And you would literally have people from both sides of the battle afterwards, amidst that just chaos and, human wasteland, you'd have people going from body to body, picking up letters just like this, and going and, bringing them back home and delivering them to mothers and fathers and wives and, loved ones, daughters, sons. So again, this is the true picture of war. And this is something that continues to happen, over and over and over again. Is war just part of human nature? Is it something that's necessary? Why do we continue to do this to each other? It's something that historians debate, philosophers debate, people debate, and however many years, tens of thousands of years into human history, we still haven't figured it out. But despite the devastation and the darkness that occurred throughout the Civil War and throughout all the wars that you look at in world history, there is an element of human decency and human compassion and human sympathy that tends to show itself even in the darkest of situations. So an example of this comes from a guy, soldier, during the Civil War named Dick Kirkland. And he was involved in a battle outside of Fredericksburg. And, the battle was raging. He was taking part. And after the battle was over, you had kind of that human wasteland, that human carnage. And you had both sides on opposite ends of the spectrum kind of looking out at the battlefield, unsure of what to do. And the people are screaming and, moaning and in pain. And Dick Kirkland goes up to his commanding officer and he says, "Sir, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to bring, those suffering people some water so that at least in their dying moments they can have, something to, ease the pain. And, I feel like they deserve this." And the general proceeds to tell him that he's crazy. And the second he goes out there into no man's land, he's going to get his head shot off. And Kirkland replies, quote, "Yes, sir, I know that. But if you will let me, I am willing to try." End quote. And Kirkland proceeded to go out into no man's land carrying a whole bunch of canteens filled with water, and neither side shot at him, and he proceeded to go out there and give water to the people who needed it and provide some measure of relief to the mortally wounded and the suffering. So a guy like Kirkland risked his life just to be a decent human being. To me, that's the ultimate as far as what makes somebody a hero and what makes someone, someone you look up to and someone that's worth studying and remembering. So stories like that, or stories like the two brothers we talked about earlier who get that final embrace and kind of make amends, it gives us hope that, there is that human element and there is that human compassion that manages to kind of shine through some of these darker events in human history. And, maybe that's the story, is that we need to find a way together to kind of endure and survive on these new and modern battlefields. If you like this episode of the podcast or any of the previous episodes, you can leave a rating or review on whatever platform you're listening to it on. I'm told this helps spread the podcast to people who might be interested in listening to it somehow. So that would be fantastic if you could do that. If you didn't like the episode, you can leave me an angry tweet and we can talk about why it was terrible. Ultimately, I'm just glad you're out there listening. So that being said, thanks for listening.